Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Flynn. I'm the public sector CTO for Boomi, a Dell Technologies company. Today, we're here to talk about something that I think is a big challenge right now in the nation, especially post-COVID and what's been happening, and that's the topic of rural broadband and the expansion of rural broadband capability throughout all areas of the country. So with me today, I have Ryan Cadera, who's the broadband manager for the Wyoming Business Council, who's been instrumental in working with government and businesses to expand Wyoming's reach of broadband across their geography. And Ryan, why don't you give a little bit of a background on yourself and what you're doing?
Uh, yeah, thanks for having me, Joe. I'm Ryan Kudra with the Wyoming Business Council. Had the advantage to start in January, pre-COVID, and I've got 20 years of experience with in the telecom industry, all the way from basically the high-level international connections, all the way down to the local telephone service. Been 20 years doing that. Even a little bit in the utility sector as well. So this is a great opportunity, and really look forward to continue to expand broadband for the state and see what we can help with across the country as well.
So to kind of frame the conversation, I think we all recognize that there is a digital divide happening within our country, whether it be broadband deserts within the urban environment or the challenge of broadband across rural parts of the nation. I think COVID-19 has truly amplified that process. And when you look at some of the statistics, um, as of Q2, as an example, 43% of office workers are now working remotely. On top of that, there was another 15% of workers who were already remote. So you're looking at almost 60% of the country now, from a work perspective, are having to work from home, either full time or partial time happening. The other part that I thought was interesting was approximately 1 million students in the K through 12 region, where they live in counties that have less than 50% wired broadband coverage, and it's a really significant issue. Ryan, when you were looking at Wyoming when you started your role, can you kind of set the frame of what was happening and what the challenges were that you were looking at?
The challenges, I some identification of areas on where there is or where there isn't coverage, or even maybe some preconceived notions of we have excellent coverage in areas that we may not have had as good as we thought. Um, by and large, I think we were in a little better standpoint than what we thought for. But we're no different than a lot of the other states that the population centers are covered relatively well. It's when you step shortly outside of that where we're encountering a lot of differential.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what we've seen, certainly economic wise, and the ability of internet providers and broadband providers at the national level, the population density challenges associated with them being able to get a return on investment for a pretty significant investment has been challenging. And as that's moved down into the local regional communities to try to solve, it's kind of bifurcated the approach, where there's these large national telcos doing stuff, and then the local organizations, whether it be a local telco or consortiums between multiple counties or towns, trying to get together to do this kind of work and implement these kind of solutions. I think it's interesting that one of the big challenges that we've seen as Boomi is the ability of access to authoritative data sources to be able to tell the story correctly, and the challenges associated with that. And let's go to the next slide, please. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what your experience was with accessing data sources that you knew were right, or you can make informed decisions on, that would guide your efforts in what you were trying to do.
In our source, Wyoming was one of the first to come up with a crowdsourced data. My predecessor and our GIS department at the University of Wyoming actually developed a speed test map that our citizens were actually able to go out and take individual speed tests and then have a crowdsourced data, which is helpful. It's definitely helpful. It identifies some areas, but honestly, some of that's getting a little older, and we're trying to figure out the next step and version 2 more or less. But even with that, we were able to go back and disprove some of what had been reported to the FCC 477 map for different projects and different entities that applied for federal funding. So while that, and that was helpful, and we actually had utilized CARES Act funding as well in August 14th when it was awarded. And the metric we required the applicants to submit maps of their coverage areas, hoping that we'd get additional maps, even if a company wasn't applying, to where we could use our own mapping to analyze. Well, unfortunately, we didn't get enough data to be able to go out and utilize our map. So we had to rely upon the 477 map, as does all the federal programs. And through that, yeah, it came very clear very fast, because I believe that data is up to 18 months old before it even gets published. So yeah, the data sets are a definite issue, and that's what we ran into.
Yeah, and I think that's not unusual for what we're seeing and again, the FCC 477 form data has a very specific use, but it is aged, and the fact that you crowdsourced data to try to use it as a reconciliation point to validate what was happening at the national level in order to direct your efforts is an interesting approach to it, and is a much more ground level kind of way to attack it. I do think that overall there is a significant challenge with the data at a national level that people are looking at, whether it be universal service implementation data or the 477 data or the data from the US Census, where the measure of does a region or a census block have connectivity resides around if one person has access to connectivity at that 25 megabit down, 3 megabit up, the entire census block is viewed as having broadband, which really does a real disservice to putting the truth on the table and understanding where it is. I think what we start talking about then is that how do we create these pools of data that are authoritative, where you can look at crowdsourced data and you can look at the 477 data and use it to change the dialogue with policymakers and decision makers, so we can start to look at how do we implement solutions that are actually fitting where we need those dollars to go to and those resources to be targeted.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of it is they are working on it. I know the president signed in a new data mapping initiative in March, and trying to kind of bring that together on the federal level. NTIA is working on mapping and the NBAM project, and that has some good, but again, a little long in the tooth data, if you will. But I think overall and I think states are actually starting to come up. I think Georgia announced last week that they have been doing their own similar identification for areas on their own, away from the 477 map. And I know we're in conversation with several states on how to further develop the maps that we have. And I think we'll start seeing a little more of that moving forward, where individual states will kind of take into the mapping on their own hands, and then try and feed that data back to NTIA, if not the FCC as well.
Have you found that post-COVID, or we're still in the middle of it actually, that there's been sort of a different emphasis now from the policymakers' position around the economic impact of this, whether it be remote work or the ability to deliver education in the K-12 space, and telemedicine? I think telemedicine is a really interesting one at this point because of the focus on solving rural healthcare and the access to hospitals and clinics, where a robust broadband capability actually would allow telemedicine to have a pretty significant impact on the outcomes of citizens that live in these rural areas.
Absolutely. I mean, it is changing. It is actually what I'm gonna say is will probably ultimately change the face of Wyoming as we move forward, because the economic development portion of this is, we produce a significant amount of green energy, have one of the largest AC transmission lines that you can build carrying nothing but green energy, as well as connectivity across the state. So we're gonna our legislators and our governor, we're looking more towards utilizing the things we have to further and expand Wyoming's economic development, as well as being able to support the remote education, the remote work. There are sections of this state that we've seen a significant impact on housing from those across the country that have seen our COVID numbers and how things have kind of worked out here. They're actually purchasing houses in Wyoming to support their remote work, remote education for their kids. And so I think it's going to be a significant impact on both those sectors, the remote work and the economic development. It's going to change the face of how we look forward. And in relation to telemedicine, Wyoming's had Wyoming Telehealth Network for several years, and their numbers increased exponentially. I mean, shortly after COVID started and everybody started staying at home, not only the use, but the providers that actually would come in, even from our neighboring states, to help provide services within Wyoming over a remote session. And we're definitely looking to expand that and keep utilizing that. I want to expand like into the agri-tech as well. There's a lot more initiative now to be able to run center pivots, et cetera, and different portions of agribusiness over the web. And we're actually working on that as well inside the business council to help develop that.
Yeah, and I think the agricultural technology stuff is really interesting because it's not just access to weather modeling and supply chain, but it's also, or even the commodities markets to do spot trading on your crops. I think it's also about the IoT portion of it, where you start talking about self-healing tractors and other equipment in the field, or equipment that is autonomous and is actually out doing the work. So you can have multiple autonomous vehicles out doing the work that you were maybe doing in one or two, or have to have multiple people working on. It's a big shift, and it drives then into manufacturing and access to supply chain and all those things, and then retail shops, and if retail isn't able to get to their suppliers online, and it has this cascading impact that it eventually starts to challenge whether or not you're going to bring business into the region, or you're going to bring people into the communities to live there, and it becomes a much more impactful to make sure that broadband becomes really synonymous with utilities like water and electricity were at the end of the last century.
Absolutely. Like I'd mentioned, you know, the influx and the change even on housing markets here, the access to broadband has been definitely reflected. I mean, it has affected home sales if they didn't have it. So that is a key factor. And relating to the Internet of Things for manufacturing and for agribusiness, I've seen sensors out there now that the farmer can place in the ground, multiple points in a field, and be able to analyze the soil at a rate that they've never been able to do before,
Yeah.
all on their phone. Here in the past probably decade, oil and gas has made a huge shift. These remote sites, they had to send somebody out every day or once a week, however they check those wells. Now, the same well that is, we have a place called Siberia Ridge. It's out, it's a long way from anything.
Sounds cold.
It's nice in the wintertime. Not really. But those things are, I mean, those wells are set up now to where they can operate them from Oklahoma City,
Yeah,
as well as anywhere in the country.
Yeah, and I think the concept around efficiency in markets and the efficiency of operations, where you're being much more judicial in how you deploy resources, becomes really a major positive out of those IoT technologies that you're referring to. So framing the problem again, I think personally when I look at this and I read about it and I invest in it, I see things around the economic impacts of this and the nationals not being able to go into these regions where they've got issues going on, or the regulatory issues around municipal broadband and some of the challenges they have about that, including how do they gather the data out of the census, um, technology, whether you're leapfrogging technologies or not, cultural stuff. I know in some of the tribal nations and tribal lands, there's very significant differences culturally about what they want to do or not do in this. And then lastly, geographically, I mean, when you get up into the mountains and way out west or up north in Wyoming, becomes, I'm sure, geographically a really difficult issue to be able to implement solutions in those areas.
Absolutely. And, you know, the economic problems going into this is the cost of development. Even with, even with the federal support and even state support, the economics, Wyoming, they say, we're just one small town with very long streets. Well, those streets are 86 to 100 and some miles long just to get
Yeah,
between, two towns that are, a few hundred people. Well, at the $86,000 a mile to put fiber in the ground, that's, yeah, the return on investment isn't there. So we have to, we get very creative in trying to cover the economic challenges to build out. Regulatory, it's interesting as everything moves away from the old switch networks into the IP. IP traffic is not regulated, so that that throws in some good, it throws in a lot of options, but what it doesn't do is when we built out electricity 100 years ago, you know, one, it was a whole different culture. Two, they had the option of different metrics they could use to get power lines put where they had to go, and we don't have that. Where it's not regulated, we don't have those options to go throw fiber up on pole lines wherever we choose. It just doesn't make that available. Um, so that that challenges things, but it definitely is things everyone's worked around for decades already. The technical aspect, especially now, is huge. Fiber. When I started 20 years ago on fiber, we called it OC 192. Well, that's basically 10 gig now. That's child's play more or less, and we're delivering that to my small town, and we can get gig to my house, and I think Bags is, I can't remember the population, like 300. Our whole valley has 9. But basically, because of ACAM, we can get gig about anywhere, including some of the distant ranches. But then we look at wireless, and with the changes in the FCC rules to meet 5G more for the mobile sector, it also opened things up for the fixed wireless plays as well. So, that is changing. Cultural differences, again, I go back to the story I've heard several times is they ran power out to the farmers farm, and he always milked cows by hand, always separated the milk by hand on a hand crank separator. Seen them, ran them. But he didn't understand until somebody actually came and showed him and hooked up an electric motor to his separator and turned on the switch. He's like, well, yeah, that's great. That is easier. But he didn't know until actually the education piece was put into play. And that is a huge issue for Wyoming, is everyone understands the high speed and the broadband bringing Netflix and access to different things and ordering Caterpillar parts or John Deere parts. But the concept of selling on Amazon or even directly is foreign. And then geography, and you're absolutely correct. There are places that even with dial tone, they'd have to serve wirelessly or with different microwave, and it's no different today. There are sections of the state that don't have any coverage other than satellite, and should they actually be reached, probably the only way they would be through a fixed wireless or not at all, unfortunately.
Yeah. So how do we fix this? I mean, you talked a little bit about technology, and is there a thought in Wyoming that you start looking at leaping technologies, and getting out of fiber, going to a fiber hub as an example, and then using 5G to run it like microwave used to be, or things like Starlink and the the low level satellite internet providers, and kind of shifting and taking that leap from the traditional wired broadband and go to some of these new technologies.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, fixing it, I go back to a statement that we have in our program that, what gets measured gets done. Um, and measuring broadband is an elusive topic for the country, and being able to figure out a decent measurement and a metric will help immensely. The data granularity, we talked census blocks, and of course, the 477 lives on that. The issue is some of the census blocks we have are large. And so if you have one house that's served along the highway, that creates problems. So being able to look past that and figure out how to mitigate that. And definitely the new technologies as they come out, the Starlink, the 5G, that's definitely going to help with the Wi-Fi, but we still have significant areas don't have any cell phone coverage. So 5G doesn't work. Starlink will help, but as the technology advances it's just like trying to look through a web page or watch a movie over dial-up. The technology on the production side or on the content side is moving much faster than what the delivery side has, and all of it has the necessary growing pains. And we've looked at Starlink, and I'll be honest, Connect Wyoming, we discluded satellite as a whole because of the latency headed to there. I've seen some initial reports on the Starlink and the low Earth orbit satellites and some of that, and it seems promising. But again, knowing the technology, it'll be interesting to see as that system loads up what the performance is.
Yeah.
As we move
What have you done in the state around public-private partnerships and even regional consortiums with other states or clustering counties together to try to solve things?
We've actually been trying to establish many joint powers board. In fact, Wyoming has a broadband grant program that basically helps develop the public-private partnership, and we've developed several of them to identify areas of need, and then needing that particular public-private partnership to move forward. We are starting to shift gears a little bit, and as the business council is the economic development arm, we can also assist maybe a little more broadly with that public and private partnership on the state level as well.
Have you had to do anything around policy or regulation changes at the state level to enable some of this?
Not really, not so much on adjustments on regulation. We did add policy for the broadband grant program. This legislature did set aside $10 million to help on the build out within the state, and they did set some policies and guidelines. We are now working on, after the Connect Wyoming initiative, we're working on additional rulemaking on the mapping, on reporting, kind of outlining the data that we need to see from the providers as what is actually out there, not necessarily what could be out there, but what is, if I called today, what service could you provide tomorrow?
Yep. Okay. And again, so as we start to look at the conclusions to this, I think that solving some of these issues really can be an engine for economic development, especially in these rural communities. I also think that the remote work and specifically remote education is going to be such a driver at so many levels. If you were to give one last thought about what's next for Wyoming and where do you go from here, it might be interesting for people to hear that relative to your population.
Honestly, I think what's next for Wyoming is kind of a paradigm shift, looking more towards the remote work, the remote education, and supporting that for our own citizens, as well as those citizens across the country and world that come to visit Wyoming as they do every year. You know, tourism is number 3 in our revenue stream. So if we can not only by building it for ourselves, it'll be easier to provide to others as they come to visit, and then also make a huge splash on what's available. Uh, we're no different than any other state and country in the world. We have huge amounts of bandwidth that pass through here every day. It's just figuring out how to utilize that best to keep building the state forward and making it a major player in the digital economy.
Okay, and with that, Ryan Cudero, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that everybody found this interesting. Again, I personally think that the topic of rural broadband access and the ability to start to focus on digital equity across the country is such an important thing right now, and really requires a significant investment from both federal, state, and private entities in order to solve it. And one of the big things around that is the ability to get the right data in the right hands at the right time to make those decisions. So with that, I am Joe Flynn, the Public Sector CTO for Boomi, a Dell Technologies company, and thank you for joining us today.